A father tells his two children something simple, almost offhand, one warm afternoon on the porch. You can shoot all the blue jays you want, but it's a sin to kill a mockingbird. He doesn't explain why right away. A neighbor has to fill that in later. Mockingbirds don't do anything harmful. They don't raid gardens or peck at anything. They just sing. All they ever do is make music for other people to enjoy. Killing one wouldn't be self-defense or pest control. It would just be cruelty for its own sake. That single, quiet lesson ends up holding together and anchoring one of the most widely read and enduring novels in American literary history. Harper Lee published To Kill a Mockingbird in 1960, and it won the Pulitzer Prize the following year, cementing its place almost immediately as a major work. It's narrated by a grown woman looking back on 3 childhood summers in a small, sleepy Alabama town. And on the surface, it's a coming-of-age story about 2 kids and their eccentric friend chasing rumors about a reclusive neighbor. Underneath that, it's a book about who a small, ordinary community decides is worth protecting and who it's willing to quietly destroy. Let's go inside it. Harper Lee sets her novel in the fictional town of Macomb, Alabama, during the early 1930s, in the depths of the Great Depression. A period of scarcity that shapes nearly every family in the story regardless of race. The narrator is Jean Louise Finch, known to everyone as Scout, who is 6 years old when the story opens and 8 by the time it ends. She lives with her older brother Jem, short for Jeremy, and their widowed father Atticus, a respected local lawyer who's raising both children largely on his own in that small southern town, with the help of Calpurnia, the Finch family's black housekeeper, who plays a far larger role in the children's upbringing than the word housekeeper really captures. Every summer, Scout and Jem are joined by a visiting boy named Dill, who comes to stay with his aunt next door and quickly becomes their closest friend and partner in invented games and elaborate summer schemes. The 3 children share a fascination bordering on obsession with the Radley house down the street, home to a recluse named Arthur, universally nicknamed Boo, who hasn't been seen outside in years. Local rumor has turned Boo Radley into something close to a local ghost story. The children have heard he once stabbed his own father with scissors, that he eats raw squirrels and cats, that he prowls the neighborhood at night while everyone else is asleep. None of this is confirmed by anyone who's actually seen him. It's simply what a small town does with a person it doesn't understand. It fills the silence with fear. Atticus Finch anchors the entire moral world of the novel. He's principled, unusually patient, and treats his children more like capable people than typical Depression-era parents might, answering their questions honestly rather than deflecting them. When Jem and Scout receive air rifles for Christmas, it's Atticus who gives them the rule about mockingbirds, and it's their neighbor Miss Maudie Atkinson who explains the reasoning behind it. That single image, an innocent creature destroyed simply because it's within reach, becomes the moral architecture the entire rest of the novel is built on top of. Macomb itself functions almost as a character in its own right. A town Lee renders with real affection, even as she exposes exactly how its social order works. Atticus's sister, Aunt Alexandra, eventually comes to live with the family and represents a different, more conventional version of Southern respectability than Atticus does. She cares deeply about family lineage and social standing, and frequently clashes with Scout's tomboyish resistance to the dresses and manners she's expected to adopt. Jem, watching Alexandra insist that the Finches are a fine family because of how long they've lived on the same land, points out the uncomfortable logic of that standard. By the same measure, the impoverished, often cruel Ewell family, who've lived on the same patch of land for generations too, would count as fine folks as well. It's a small moment, but it's Jem starting to notice how thin and self-serving some of Macomb's proudest social distinctions really are once you look closely at them. Much of the novel's early section plays out through the children's own invented dramas, particularly their obsessive, half-terrified fascination with getting Boo Radley to come outside where they might finally see him for themselves. They act out exaggerated, gothic little plays about his rumored history, daring each other to touch the Radley house, inventing increasingly elaborate schemes to catch a glimpse of him. Atticus, when he catches them at this, reprimands them gently but firmly, encouraging a more sympathetic view of a man they've turned into a monster without ever actually meeting him. Slowly, almost accidentally, small signs suggest Boo is paying far closer attention to the children than anyone realizes. Scout and Jem discover small gifts left for them in the knothole of an old tree near the Radley property. Sticks of gum, old coins, tiny carved soap figures that turn out to be crude likenesses of the two children themselves. When Jem loses his pants sneaking around the Radley yard one night and returns later to retrieve them, he finds them mended and neatly folded, as though someone had quietly taken care of them and left them exactly where he'd find them. The gifts stop when Boo's brother, Nathan Radley, fills the tree's knothole with cement, claiming the tree is sick. A claim Atticus quietly points out doesn't hold up, since the tree looks perfectly healthy. It's a small, devastating moment for Jem in particular, who is old enough by now to sense that something real and kind was happening in that knothole, and that it's just been sealed away by someone determined to keep Boo isolated. Not long after, during a rare winter house fire at a neighbor's home, someone slips a blanket around Scout's shoulders while she stands outside watching the blaze in the cold, too focused on the flames and the commotion to notice who did it. Only later does she and Jem realize it must have been Boo, standing quietly behind them the entire time, close enough to help, but still unwilling or unable to be seen. Dill contributes his own strange, sympathetic theory about Boo during this stretch of the novel, one night admitting to Scout that he thinks Boo simply has nowhere else to go, that whatever happened to him inside that house years earlier left him without the kind of place in the wider world that everyone else takes for granted. It's an oddly tender idea coming from a child who spent most of the novel treating Boo as an object of spooky entertainment. And it marks one of the earliest moments where the children's fascination starts quietly curdling into something closer to sympathy, well before Scout ever gets an actual look at his face. The novel's central conflict arrives when Atticus is appointed by the court to defend Tom Robinson, a black man accused of raping a white woman named Mayella Ewell. Atticus could likely have found a way to handle the case quietly, minimally, the way many white lawyers in the segregated South of that era might have. Instead, he decides to actually defend Tom, as though the outcome matters, fully aware of exactly how unpopular that decision will make him and his children in Maycomb. The fallout arrives almost immediately. Scout gets into fights at school after classmates mock her for having a father who defends the wrong kind of client. Jem and Scout are taunted and isolated by other children, even at their own extended family's Christmas gathering, where a young cousin repeats an ugly insult about Atticus's decision that he's clearly absorbed from adults at home. An insult Scout doesn't fully understand the weight of, but immediately recognizes as an attack worth defending her father against. Atticus never asks his children to hide from any of this or pretend it isn't happening. Instead, he tells them plainly that more of it is coming, and that the people saying these things are, underneath it, still their neighbors, and still capable of decency. A nuance that asks a great deal of two children still working out how the world is supposed to make sense. The night before the trial, a group of men gathers outside the jail where Tom is being held, intending to drag him out and lynch him before the trial can even happen. Atticus, alone, sits outside the jailhouse door to physically stand between the mob and Tom. Jem and Scout, who have secretly followed him into town, arrive in the middle of the standoff, and it's Scout, recognizing one of the men in the crowd as the father of a boy she knows from school, who unknowingly diffuses the entire situation. She asks him politely about his son, a completely ordinary question that suddenly makes him visible again as an individual person rather than an anonymous part of a mob, and shames him into leading the other men away. It's one of the novel's clearest illustrations of Atticus's belief that people are rarely monstrous as individuals, even when they're capable of monstrous things in a crowd, a distinction that will matter again later, when he insists to his children that classmates who repeat ugly things about him at school are, underneath it, still their friends. At the trial itself, Scout, Jem, and Dill watch from the balcony reserved for Maycomb's black residents, seated beside Reverend Sykes and the rest of the congregation who welcomed the children warmly once word spread that Atticus was the one defending Tom. From up there, they watch Atticus build a defense that methodically, patiently dismantles the Yule's entire account of what happened. Atticus establishes, clearly and carefully, that the injuries on Maella's face are concentrated on the right side, consistent with a blow from someone left-handed. And Tom Robinson's left arm is permanently crippled and largely useless, the result of an old accident with a cotton gin, making him physically incapable of inflicting exactly the injuries he's accused of causing. The far more plausible explanation, gradually surfacing through the testimony, is that Maella herself had approached Tom, was caught by her father Bob Yule in the act, and was then beaten by him for it, with a rape accusation against Tom, serving as a way to cover her own shame and deflect her father's fury onto someone else entirely. Tom's own testimony is quiet, careful, and consistent, and includes one detail the all-white jury seems to hold against him more than almost anything else. When asked why he'd help Maella with chores around her home, at all, free of charge, Tom says simply that he felt sorry for her. A black man expressing pity for a white woman in that courtroom, in that era, lands as its own kind of transgression. The prosecution's entire case rests almost entirely on the word of Maella and her father, and Atticus is careful, in his questioning, never to attack Maella cruelly, even as he methodically exposes the holes in her account. He understands, and makes sure the jury sees, that she is in many ways as trapped by her circumstances as anyone else in the courtroom, a poor, isolated young woman living under a violent father with essentially no one else looking out for her. That nuance doesn't save Tom, but it's part of what makes Atticus's closing argument land as something more complicated than a simple appeal to fairness. He's asking the jury to see multiple people clearly at once, including a young white woman most of them would rather not examine too closely either. Despite evidence that leaves almost no reasonable doubt, the all-white jury convicts Tom Robinson. Atticus isn't surprised exactly, even if he's disappointed. He understood from the beginning that a fair reading of the evidence and a fair verdict from that particular jury were two entirely different things. As the verdict is read and the courtroom empties, the black spectators in the balcony rise silently to their feet as Atticus gathers his papers and walks out below them. A gesture of respect the children don't fully understand in the moment, though Scout registers, without yet having the words for it, that something significant has just happened between her father and the people watching from where she's sitting. Bob Yule, despite having technically won the case, feels humiliated rather than victorious. Atticus's cross-examination exposed him publicly as a liar, and almost certainly as the person who actually beat his own daughter in a fit of rage and shame. That humiliation curdles into a slow, burning need for revenge. Yule begins harassing people connected to the trial. He threatens Tom Robinson's widow, attempts to break into the presiding judge's house, and confronts Atticus directly outside the post office, spitting in his face in front of onlookers. Atticus characteristically absorbs the insult without retaliating, telling Jem afterward that he'd rather Yule take his anger out on him than on anyone Yule might see as an easier target. Not long after the trial, while awaiting the appeal Atticus was already preparing, Tom Robinson is shot and killed while attempting to escape from prison. The novel is careful about how it frames this. Tom didn't run because he was guilty. He ran because he'd already watched the system fail him completely once, and had no real reason left to believe a second chance through that same system would end any differently. The local newspaper editor writes an editorial comparing Tom's death to the senseless slaughter of songbirds, deliberately echoing Atticus's lesson from the very beginning of the novel. Tom Robinson is the Mockingbird the title has been pointing toward the entire time. A man who never did anything but try to help, destroyed anyway by people who decided his life mattered less than their own comfort. Atticus, delivering the news of Tom's death to his own household, is visibly shaken in a way the children have rarely seen from him. A small crack in the composed, unflappable figure they've spent the whole novel watching absorb every other insult and threat without visible strain. Months pass, and Bob Yule's resentment never fully dissipates the way Atticus hoped it would. On Halloween night, as Scout and Jem walk home alone from a school pageant in the dark, Yule finally acts on it, attacking the two children on the road home. Scout, trapped inside a bulky, awkward ham costume from the pageant, can't see much of what happens next. She hears Jem struggling with someone, hears the sound of his arm breaking, and then feels the confusion of another person suddenly present, pulling the attacker away from them in the dark. In the chaos, Bob Ewell ends up fatally stabbed. The man who intervened carries the injured Jem home through the dark, and once they're inside the Finch house, under the light of the bedroom lamp, Scout finally gets a clear look at their rescuer's face for the first time in the entire novel. It's Boo Radley, the ghost story, the monster the children spent years inventing, standing quietly in Jem's bedroom, having just saved both their lives. Sheriff Hectate arrives and, after piecing together what actually happened, makes a deliberate decision. He tells Atticus and the household that Bob Ewell died by falling on his own knife, an account that isn't strictly true and that both men clearly understand isn't strictly true. Atticus initially resists this, worried that covering for Boo, however protective the motive, isn't the right thing to do. He spent the whole novel insisting that the law should apply evenly and honestly, and this request asks him to quietly set that principle aside for someone he cares about, the exact kind of selective mercy he might have criticized in someone else. But Tate is firm, and Scout, listening quietly, understands exactly what her father is being asked to accept, dragging a genuinely gentle, deeply private man who just saved her brother's life into a public inquest and a media spectacle, purely to give proper credit for killing a man who'd already tried to murder 2 children, would be its own form of cruelty. She tells Atticus that doing so would be sort of like shooting a mockingbird. The lesson he gave her years earlier about an innocent creature that only ever sang has come all the way back around, and this time, it's Scout doing the teaching. To Kill a Mockingbird works simultaneously as 2 different kinds of story, and Harper Lee never lets either one crowd out the other. On one level, it's a Bildungsroman, a coming-of-age novel tracking how Scout and Jem's understanding of their town, their father, and the surrounding adult world deepens and grows more complicated over roughly 2 long, formative years. They begin the novel treating Boo Radley as an object of gothic entertainment, a character in a game they've invented, and end it recognizing him as a real, complicated, deeply kind person they nearly destroyed through nothing but rumor and unexamined fear. On the other level, the novel is a clear-eyed, unflinching account of how deeply racial injustice was embedded into the legal and social machinery of the segregated American South during that era, not as an aberration or a single bad actor's failure, but as the ordinary, expected outcome of a system that had been carefully built that way, on purpose over generations. Atticus doesn't lose Tom Robinson's case because his defense was weak or incomplete in some fixable way. He loses because the jury's verdict was never actually going to be decided by the evidence sitting in front of them. Lee is careful never to suggest that good intentions or a compelling legal argument are enough to overcome that kind of structural injustice on their own. Atticus's moral courage matters enormously in the novel, but the novel is equally clear that his courage alone couldn't save Tom Robinson's life. The title's Mockingbird symbol threads through both of these stories at once. Tom Robinson and Boo Radley are the novel's 2 mockingbirds, 2 people who never hurt anyone, who are nonetheless nearly destroyed, in Tom's case, fatally, by a community's fear, prejudice, and need for a convenient target. Lee's quiet argument is that recognizing a mockingbird when you see one and choosing not to destroy it just because you can is one of the most basic tests of a person's or a town's actual character. Harper Lee based much of Atticus Finch on her own father, a lawyer in small-town Alabama, and the novel arrived in 1960, right as the American civil rights movement was gathering the momentum that would define the decade that followed. It's sold more than 40 million copies since, been translated into roughly 40 languages, and remains one of the most commonly assigned novels in American schools, which means generations of readers have grown up learning its central lesson right alongside Scout and Jem. Lee published only one other novel in her lifetime, Go Set a Watchman, technically written earlier, but released decades later as something closer to a sequel, following an adult Scout returning home to a father whose views have grown far more complicated. a book that unsettled many readers precisely because it refused to let Atticus remain the uncomplicated moral figure this novel builds him into. The novel never pretends that one good man's conscience is enough to fix a broken system, and it never lets its child narrator's growing wisdom feel like an easy resolution to genuinely unresolved injustice. What it offers instead is smaller and, in its own way, harder. The idea that seeing another person clearly, past the rumors and the fear and the easy assumptions, is the beginning of any kind of real decency. And that failing to do that, whether toward a quiet man in a house down the street or a decent man in a courtroom, is its own quiet, ordinary kind of sin. If this breakdown helped the story click for you, subscribe. We're going through the books your teacher assigned, but nobody actually explained. See you in the next one.